Okay. So future self. Hey girl, hey. My brain was busy this morning as soon as I woke up talking about more things that I need to kind of document for myself. Again, the reason I'm doing these videos is because I'm making friends with the varying nature of my personal development and growth, the ups and downs, and making space for those times when I know I'm going to be low and I'm going to want to be reminded of the progress that I made. Because when people get, what clinicians want to call depression, when people get in this energy of like you literally don't have the energy, like you don't have that resource. When you're in that state, you can tend to be really vulnerable. And for me, I know that it feels like this is the first time this has ever happened. It's never been this bad, and that's just simply not true. The other thing that my brain will tell me is that this is always how it is. And, this too shall pass, but it's also going to come right back around. So fuck everything. This is how it is. This is life. Alicia, I want you to remember that the videos that you're making, are documenting, leaps and bounds of achievement that you've made, honey. Like, understand that you know a lot. You know a lot. And you don't know that you know a lot. So documenting these things that your brain just keeps churning out is important. And I hope that I remember to watch these when I'm low, because I will get there. So this video is going to be about that thing that I keep talking about that I think people get wrong. They just have it wrong. And it's kind of the crux of a lot of dysfunction in human emotional development. And that is narcissism. So I think I'm going to title this video like something to do with, have you hugged your narcissist today? It's going to make people really upset and puke and whatever, but because there are entire support groups. There's this thing called, Al-Anon, which they say is for survivors of addicts and alcoholics, the family members, it's a support group for the people who are close to alcoholics, when really, like, if you go to those groups and you look at the literature, you look at the material that they're drawing from, you look at those resources, you pick them apart and you open your mind and you realize this isn't about substance abuse. This isn't about a disease in the brain that makes us make terrible choices despite serious consequences over and over and over. It's not about the addiction. It's about the narcissism that is fluffed up and maintained, and that becomes, this thing that we want to call a disease that makes the affected person different, and it puts them in a box, and it's something that we can define this experience in this way, and that makes sense for a lot of people. For me, it was toxic. It was corrosive. It was bad. And it fed that narcissism within me. And it fueled that fire. So I'm going to talk about what I'm talking about when I say narcissism, because I don't think it's the same thing that these support group people are getting together and like villainizing and making others out of their perpetrator, they're the victim of, unknowingly actually feeding their own codependent and covert narcissism in doing that. So like sitting down and villainizing and making others out of the narcissist that hurt you is not healing for you, and it's not helpful for them. It's actually just fueling the problem. And I'm going to talk about why. But first, I want to start the video with a quote from a book by Carson McCullers called The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. This book was written by her when she was only 23 years old. And it's very celebrated, so I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it. I'm sure a lot of people have read it. Maybe you're even wondering, like, why the hell is she reading from this book in a video about narcissism? I'm hoping that this excerpt will help to illustrate the corrosive, like, thread that narcissism is through our society, like how it's interwoven, and it has to do with why we have, like, a lot of confusion and, like, heated arguments around things like human rights and civil rights and gender issues, things like that. It's the narcissism that's inherent within the human experience. And this illustrates it, I think, really well. So this is page 146. What is this? Is this a Penguin? No, it's a Mariner Books edition. So this is where a man called Dr. Copeland, who is a black doctor in the South. I can't remember. Shoot. I know it's like So McCullers was born in 1917, and this book is set in the 1930s. Dr. Copeland is a black doctor who is one of the protagonists in the novel. And I guess, like, what you need to know about him for this to make the sense that I want it to is that he's got a lot of bitterness, and he's very uncomfortable with, he's not okay with the lack of emotional intelligence that is found within the people in his community. He's angry and embittered about a lack of progress where, like, race issues are concerned, and that is an emotional intelligence issue, like we talked about in the last video. So Dr. Copeland is coming into the family, the home of a family, and so one of the family members has just been invited to read from the Bible. So her name is Portia, and she read from the book of Luke. And then this is what happens. So this always gets me. I'm trying to read Huck Finn out loud in school I can't do this. Okay, so I done pondered over this thing many a time, said Grandpa. The people in the room came out from their drowsiness. What? Asked Portia. It is this way. You recall them parts about Jesus raising the dead and curing the sick? Course we does, sir, said Hi-Bye differentially. Hi-Bye? Hi-Boy, sorry. Reading out loud is not... Okay, so many a day when I've been plowing or working, Grandpapa said slowly, I done thought and reasoned about the time when Jesus going to descend again to this earth. 'Cause I done always wanted it so much. It seemed to me like it will be while I'm living. I done studied about it many a time. And this here the way I done planned it. I reason I will get to stand before Jesus with all my children's, my grandchildren's, my great-grandchildren's, and kinfolks and friends, and I say to him, Jesus Christ, us is all sad colored folks. And then he will place his holy hand upon our heads, and straightway us will all be white as cotton. That the plan and reasoning that been in my heart a many a time. A hush fell on the room. Dr. Copeland jerked the cuff of his sleeves and cleared his throat. His pulse beat too fast and his throat was tight. Sitting in the corner of the room, he felt so isolated, angry, and alone. I want this part of the book to stand out. Alicia, and anybody watching my videos who relates. Not all anger is toxic and bad for society. Not all embittered responses or approaches are inappropriate. And when we look at a society that not that long ago fostered and encouraged a rhetoric that said, if you are blessed, if you are worth help and blessings, if you're doing well enough to deserve help, the help you're going to get in your wildest dreams, in your wildest faith-filled, hope-filled daydreams is to be made something that you're not so that life will be easier. Do you understand what I'm getting at? Like, you're supposed to be angry. You're supposed to be embittered. Yeah. Okay. So that lack of emotional intelligence, that lack of even his fellow person of color had such a lack of emotional intelligence that he felt like the answer to his problems, is that, like, what's wrong with him is the color of his skin. He would be happy if he was white, if he and his family and his kinfolk were white as cut, and that would be the answer to all of his problems. And when we delve into seeking services from a lot of mental health care providers, we're kind of doing the same thing. We're kind of saying, hey, for whatever reason, I don't blend with society. I feel really isolated. I feel really angry. I feel really alone. And I feel like my mental health is suffering. I feel like I might be crazy, or I'm just not functioning to my potential in this world. And so when we seek those services, we are absolutely saying, my life would be so much easier if I fit the norm, or if I was something that I am not. Remember, when we go to seek the services of a professional, or if we go to even just like a retail store where we expect the people who are selling things that they will know what all those things are for and like the appropriate use for them. We go to those people as customers to consult with them because we hope or we believe that they know better than us, right? That's why we're seeking their services. The customer is never right. The ploy, the sort of manipulation, or the way that we play on people, emotionally, especially, to make money and to exploit that humanity, is to make them think that they're always right. That's where that distinction is, that little ism that people in business will say, the customer is always right. That's because when you approach them with that, notion, it fluffs that ego, and it makes that customer spend money. When really everybody in the room knows the customer is wrong. That's why the customer is coming to consult. When we're seeking services for mental health, we're admitting that we are wrong and what we are is wrong, and we need somebody else to tell us how to be okay, how to be something that we're not, we're asking somebody else to define our needs for us and then show us how to ask, or how to meet those needs, ask for what we need. And that's really good. Like I've said before, it's really good for the economy, and it's really good. It's hand in hand with that role that society plays as far as like narrowing the scope of what's appropriate, what's moral normative within your society, within your culture to ask for, to have as a need openly and in public, more or less. So in this video, gosh, we're already 13 minutes in, 14. Define narcissism in two different ways. We're going to ask what's the difference between the Webster version and the more diagnostic statistic manual. We're going to talk about how a lot of mental health care, and especially the philosophy around hard to treat disorders, like the cluster, I think it's B and C personality disorders in the DSM, that have to do with like antisocial, avoidant, narcissistic, borderline personality disorders. A lot of depression and anxiety disorders can fall into these categories of like hard to treat mental health, behavioral health problems, and how the way we treat those is really, the way that we in like modern America, like my experience in the system as a recipient of care and as a provider of care has shown me that that's what the industry does. We spew out these self-fulfilling prophecies, so that people have like a controlled, defined way to fail. Cause we'll get into that. That's failure, toxicity, getting into all these trigger words that people just cringe at. Like it's gonna happen. So these services or these entities within our society are really, like the intentions are fine. They're trying to provide a safe place to do that. We're gonna get into, of course, what is ego. We're gonna get into, we're gonna expand on those mental health services really, being a continuation and a prop up for the way that our society, especially on the economic level, functions and is sustained by exploitation. So we're creating these self-fulfilling prophecies. We're creating this like confined, safe space to fail. And then we're actually, it's really easy to just draw from that population because we have it all defined and exploit that. Really important stuff to be aware of as we are developing our self-awareness and our emotional capacities, right? Okay, so the DSM define it's a long definition, so I'm going to try to kind of crunch it down. The DSM is going to define narcissistic personality disorder as like a problematic predisposition with self. We of course all think of the story of Narcissus from Greek mythology. When we think of Narcissism, he dies, he wastes away gazing in at his own reflection. That's sort of the Webster, this like preoccupation with self, or like an over exaltation of self, and self being, that egoic, material identity. And we'll get more into that later. Whereas, so that's Webster. And then the DSM is saying that, but it's also giving, the other side of the coin. So there is this preoccupation, predisposition, or like exaltation of the ego self. But then the other side of that coin is they're doing that because the self is wounded, or like the way the self is perceived is bad, is negative. There's an element of self-loathing, and you cannot have self-loathing to such a degree that it's detrimental to your development and the ability to function within relationships and connections intimately with other people. You can't have a dysfunction there without having like a preoccupation with self. Like you can't hate yourself and not think about yourself too much. So that the DSM gives us two sides to the coin. The Webster definition is kind of the same, but it's very one-dimensional. DSM gives us it pops it out just a little bit more, gives us some more specific details about what it looks like. Because remember, when we're talking about the diagnostic statistics manual for diagnosing mental disorders, that statistic word, we're using measurable, raw, numeric data to diagnose. So if you have a practitioner in your chair, or you're in his or her chair, and they're saying, they're having this conversation with you, asking you these questions, they're not writing any values down. They're not using a diagnostic PHQ-9 or GAD-7. They're not using statistic data. They're not using raw numeric statistics to diagnose you. You need to find somebody else. Because when we start getting really subjective and biased about, it sounds like to me what you're describing is kind of an OCD kind of, that's not okay. That's not okay. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're planting in the mind of somebody. If you're going to be diagnosed, or if you're going to diagnose somebody using the DSM, especially, like, you need to actually use statistics. You need to use numbers. And it's really hard to find numeric values for things when we're talking about behavior and emotion. So, if you're going to buy into that, the school of thought of modern mental health services, you got to know that things are done separate from the way they say they're being done. Like doing what you say you're doing and saying that you're doing what you're doing don't always happen. And like I kind of touched on before, we have to realize that people getting into a position where they're making money by offering goods and services to sick people, who are sick on the level of emotional development and their ability to meet their own needs, like that's exploitation city. And I'm sorry, like I'm sure there are a lot of clinicians that got into the field because they felt a sense of like, I need a purpose. I need a meaningful, I have a calling. I want to make a difference in this life. And they at some point knew that emotional development was really important. And it's something that people need help with. I'm sure that that's where people start. But if you can't develop beyond your interest in helping others or your pursuit of purpose and understand that you can't fix people and that you can't provide purpose, you can't provide the doorway for people to walk through to find their own needs. If you can't grow up and out of that and then start using the tools that, like, hey, you're in the pot now, like it's boiling. You went to school for 8-10 years and you're continuing your education and that's your career and you're 50 and you can't switch. You at some point you have to wake up to the fact that the reason that you got into the industry, it can't be the same reason you stay in the industry. And you have to grow out of a covert narcissistic idea that says, I am so important. My quest for meaning and purpose out of a career is so important that's what I'm going to seek and that's what I'm going to do. You have to grow up and out and beyond that narcissistic thought into the awareness that if this is actually what you're doing, if helping people grow and develop emotionally is actually what you're doing, you're doing a disservice to them because they need to open that door. Do you see what I'm saying? At some point, that clinician needs to understand their purpose is no longer self-fulfillment. Like they are not going to get that level of self-actualization. They're not going to get purpose out of a career. They're not going to get meaning out of the way that they get money, especially not, telling people what their needs are and what's okay to ask for, what's okay to be in need, who they are. Like at some point that needs to be realized. So when we're talking about diagnosing something using, like a manual, like the DSM is like the Bible, is like basic instructions for, diagnosing people. So it has to be, statistic. It has to be things that we can break down into numbers, which is really hard to do with emotions. So be really aware that that's hard. So the path of least resistance in any time that this is happening is to go with we'll call it an intuitive, the first counselor that I had said that he learned from a man who was very intuitive in his diagnosing, which, I think is not okay. He said it like it was this wonderful thing. It's not okay. It's never okay. You're never that good. As a diagnostician of human behavior and emotion, no human is that good. You have to use numbers. And because it's hard to break emotional things down into, we can't quantify sadness. It's not straightforward. So the next jump is, what do I feel? What's the somatic, reactive, impulsive response? That's in this context, when we talk about intuitively, I just know you're bipolar. Like that's horseshit and it's not okay. So and the ways that they actually do try to break down emotive things that really can't be quantified are things using relativistic terms. So an example of that would be when we define addiction as continued use or participation in a behavior despite consequences. So like there are consequences to us repeating this behavior, but we can't not do this behavior. Like no matter how bad the consequences get, like that's how you define that there's a problem and that you need to be like removed from your environment and kept away from that behavior or whatever. So it's, you know, these are kind of relativistic terms because like, okay, so, a consequence, it can be really obviously going to jail because you killed somebody driving drunk. Having your children taken away because you would rather leave them in a hot car to go chase your next, what do they call it? Bang or whatever, your next fix. You'd rather leave your kids, and forget about them. You're not even high at this point. You're just gonna get high soon. You'd rather just leave your kids and try to go get high because you're not high now. So your kids get taken away, and that's definitely a consequence. But what about when we're getting off on spending money and providing nice things for ourselves, and then at like the end of the month we don't have enough to put gas in our car, or we run out of food before we get paid again and we have to go ask for money? Do we see that, like the need to go into debt for the sake of providing nice things for ourselves? That's a problem. Justifying going into debt so that you can have nice things, that's an addiction. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. It's that there's a consequence there. Like running out of food at the end of the month is a consequence, but you're going to continue to provide nice things for yourself the next time you get paid. Do you see? But a lot of people wouldn't see that. They wouldn't see, the consequence, you know, like, so you spend money. You can't compare, you know, a spending problem to my heroin addiction. That's horseshit. You can't compare traumas. You can't compare addictions. When it's a problem, it's a problem. If you're doing it despite consequences, you're doing it despite consequences. And so when we want to go and talk about personality disorders and like how well you function within a society as you're meeting your own needs, how you communicate your needs, and we use relativistic terms, distress causes distress. A person practices this behavior or has this tendency to the degree that it causes problems is a very relativistic way to go about quantifying an experience. So it doesn't work, because that's all I'm trying to say is it doesn't work. And there's no human being on the face of this earth that has such amazing intuition and experience in the field that they can accurately say, you know, that this person has this desire in a sick way, or has this desire in a sideways way, or has this desire in a healthy way. The only person that can make that call is you. And paying somebody to tell you who you are is just asking for trouble. So we have to recognize how cultural and moral normative the data really is when we're talking about mental and behavioral health. So everything about how we define and treat these issues has everything to do with how you are perceived and received by society at large. So do you see how subjective this is? And do you also see how basically useless. A lot of this is outside of a capitalist setting. So in a hunter-gatherer situation, would it really matter that like you think about yourself so much and how much you hate yourself, that you're preoccupied with self-hatred, and like can't make and sustain relationships that, I don't know, like why would that even be a problem in a hunter-gatherer situation? Like anybody that lives in that society is contributing. And if they have like emotional problems with how they feel about that, like that's taken care of. Like that's apparent because you're a functioning whole. A hunter-gatherer society doesn't have, the luxury of like, I don't know, how do I put it? Like they don't have the luxury of FMLA because you had a mental breakdown. Like, don't talk about it with us. Go see a counselor, go unload, go get yourself a billing ID so that you can unload this stuff and come back and be what we need you to be instead of what you are. I don't know if that makes sense. It does to me, but so again, it's a setup or a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I'll give you an example. So when I first received services, it was like on the down low. I was a minor. Like I said before, it really wasn't something that was acknowledged, or mental health just wasn't. Like if you can't, some of my earliest memories are like, one is my head is being held, like somebody's holding my head in their hands and they're just like so pissed off and they're mad and they're just looking at me and they're begging me to understand, like, just be normal, just be cool. Why can't you just be cool? So we see, I'm walking into services with this idea that I'm not cool, I'm not okay, I'm not normal. First of all, and that to have these problems, it's all in your head. It's not real. You're just dumb. Like, stop. Just be normal. Just stop. That was the philosophy that I'm walking into therapy with. Is just that, like, I'm just wrong. So I received my services as a minor through a publicly funded behavioral health services hub in Long Beach, Washington. So at 15 or 16, I met my first counselor, who is a social worker who is well regarded as a diagnostician for his long career working with, traumatized girls and battered women. This guy's scope was shaped by his own life focus. So he had his own trauma. So he had that trauma-informed focus as far as like the approach to the social work that he did. So right off the bat, this guy sees a traumatized child, right? I'm snot-nosed, I'm crying, I'm hyperventilating, I'm not okay, tell me how to be okay. He sees a traumatized child. So right off the bat, and he sees, a teenager with the emotional maturity of a child, and bam, of course, it's a traumatized ego. When I asked to address, the difficulty that I had at 15, 16 with, human intimacy and forming relationships, like I dropped out of school. I think it was the end of my 10th grade year, the beginning of my 11th, my junior year, because, it wasn't because schooling was like the work was hard for me or like digesting information was hard for me. It was because being in the presence of other human beings was fucking painful, intolerable. There was no window of tolerance being in a school at that time. So instead of talking about attachment or like attachment styles or where they come from or what avoidant attachment looks like and where it comes from, what it's caused by, this guy does a sympathetic like sound, like, oh, and he says, "Oh, Alicia, you just don't get social." So he's drawing from the little bit of knowledge that he knows. He's assuming that I'm traumatized and that I have low emotional IQ, low capacity for empathy. I'm this immature, emotionally, I'm a child. So, so it, and I get it. It makes sense. It would just not click. Social maybe just doesn't click. I just don't get it. Being traumatized, being, so when we develop our ego, we're forced, it's during our first traumas. We develop our ego when we're forced into an awareness of otherness. Okay. Wow. I must be, we become aware at some age, sometimes it's really inappropriately young, that there are things that can hurt us, that we need to be protected, and that we are separate. That's where the ego starts developing. It's a protective thing. It was never meant to be this like wounded, ugly thing that we turn into narcissism and talk about behind closed doors, without facing our own. And that's all it took. So one person telling me, you don't get it. And that's all it took. And I ran with it. And then it was just like, I'm off the hook. I don't have to try to be curious about other people's emotional experience. And I don't have to be curious about experiencing my own emotional pain and process. I just don't get social. So it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another self-fulfilling prophecy from a god in his own mind among chemical dependency professionals is this rhetoric of, you are not trustworthy. You're in services because you have established the proof that you are not trustworthy. You cannot make healthy choices. You hold free will in the palm of your hand, but you will never wield that power until you're able to, like, how do they say it? Like, give it away to get it, or, surrender to God. Which, I mean, like, again, we're going to get into like intentions. Intentions are fine. Like, everybody has the best of intentions, but I'm going to talk about why this is sick. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is probably this chemical dependency idea that, you can't be trusted. You've established that you make poor choices. This is more insidious than it appears, I think, to a lot of people, because it's separating you from your power and placing your ego or some imaginary self-identifying, self-separating element in between you and that power. So you can't, they're throwing this imaginary bullshit villain that you are, your ego, you're untrustworthy, you're bad, you're toxic. They're throwing that up in your face and making a smokescreen, all the while like free will is just on the other side of that. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the way that they tell you to sort of like get to the other side of that is, give it away to God, or let the group tell you what to do. Once again, it's giving away that. It's just continuing the need for goods and services. It's continuing and sustaining a victim lack mentality. I use the word insidious to tie in with how and why therapy, especially old school modalities and diagnostic methods, actually feed the fire of the sick or wounded ego, which we all have. Simply put, the ego is not self. It's a lie. It's a conditioned, adapted notion of otherness or individuality on a material dimension. It's first and foremost protective. We come into this world with needs that we don't know how to ask for or like how to meet them. They're built in. So we have built-in not met needs. We have built-in trauma. Trauma is unmet need. The ego comes online as a protective barrier. Suddenly, traumas occur and we are betrayed. We are, as children, we're ripped apart from Eden. We're ripped from wholeness, from unity when we're threatened, when our needs aren't met and we feel what that feels like. We become other. We become something that can be threatened. That's when the ego comes online. It's protective. It's an awareness of otherness. It's an awareness of this idea of self, which is not real. We are Okay. So the ego comes online as a protection, and we're ripped away, we're ripped away from that Eden. We wouldn't have egos if we didn't come in contact intimately with unmet needs. We wouldn't have an ego. And every single human on this earth has an ego. Don't listen to that Eckhart Tolle dude that says he doesn't have an ego. Like, the experience of the trauma and unmet need is what defines our otherness or our need. Our unique needs define the trauma, and the trauma is what forms the ego or material. It's where the material and the emotional worlds collide, and we become, in our own minds, female, heterosexual, professional, bodybuilder, mother, daughter. That's why when people ask us, who are you? That scene from Alice in Wonderland where the worm is, blowing the smoke rings. Who are you? And she gives all these answers, and no, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. So this is why when asked who we are, we rattle off various tired titles, roles, diagnoses, etc. This is all ego content instead of simply saying, I am but one aspect or one part of a whole, and leave it there with a full heart, and to be able to just say, that's what I am, and know it. That's what ego is. Mental health is the study or a preoccupation with how that ego interacts with the world, or how that ego goes about meeting its needs as this separate, protective, defensive version of us makes a life within a community. To break it down further, mental health services define our needs for us and teach us to assign moral good or bad labels on them. It's about fostering an environment where the ego, which is equal to a wound, can really develop and fester. If you are lucky, that ego dies and is rebirthed, and it's a cycle that just happens over and over. And there you're able to level up and rebuild from the ground up, and you are able to, hold that jar in your awareness, and you are the authority that gets to say, what goes in there and what happens to the things that are already in that jar that make up who you really are, your experience. What are the things that you can't remove, that you're not supposed to remove, that need to be transmuted and turned into something else and reintegrated into the whole? So yeah, if you're lucky, that ego will die and you can rebuild. So, a lot of you are probably saying, Alicia, you're paranoid. Of course, mental health services are not out to keep people sick. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about intentions. Like I said, we would hit on before. DBT, for example, was developed as a tool to help study, not treat. It was never a modality of treatment. And it was never a modality of treatment for, borderline, like all these hard to treat disorders. This was a tool to use to study the phenomena of suicide. And let me put something here. It is a phenomena. And we get it wrong all the time. And it's a really good example of what's going on now with like post-COVID, now that we've swept it under the rug. We're seeing mental health, complications, and we're seeing people, with long-term, physical symptoms or effects from COVID who are suicidal. They want to die, but they're not suicidal in the way that we traditionally think of suicidality. It's not this narcissistic, self-absorbed, poor me, I'm going to die and go eat worms, nobody loves me. These people are illustrating a very real and very common phenomenon that is, I don't want to die. I just don't see a quality of life worth living in my future. Do you see? So DBT was developed as a tool to help study the phenomena of suicide. When it became a treatment intervention, that's when it becomes behavior modification. CBT, a peer-reviewed, evidence-based modality, one of few. DBT cannot say that. EMDR cannot say that. One of the only treatment modalities that can say that came from a guy who just wanted to understand depression better than how the psychoanalysts were talking about it at the time. It was a tool to help you learn more. It was never meant to be, here's your answer, now run with it. Like, no, these things that wind up being helpful we're not setting out to fix people. The human experience isn't fixed. The things that end up working are helpful are the things that are developed because we're curious, because we want to learn more, not fix. Does that make sense? When those findings about CBT translate to the practicing fields of mental and behavioral health, we see automatic thoughts. This thing that, I can't remember his name, Dr. Aaron something came up with. We see these automatic thoughts turned into diagnostic jargon, turning into ways to define, categorize, and talk about the wounded ego further. And unfortunately, I think a lot of this kind of thinking is what projected or like jettisoned a lot of our talk about like neuroses and neurotic people. Unfortunately, people who think a lot, or people who ruminate or worry about things, or maybe they have a really slow process when they're digesting information. It takes them a long time and people think it looks like ruminating. So I guess what I'm saying is that just because we use these things as a tool to sort of bolster our curiosity and to learn more, just because they sort of seem to answer some questions, it's really important that we don't like take that as a God's honest truth, end of the story, answer and run with it. Because we can identify automatic thoughts is proof that we didn't know what we didn't know. It's not permission to glom onto that automatic thought within a person and their experience and say, you have OCD, you have a problem that has to be treated. That's not helpful. So these expansions and our working understanding of emotional development become cages and tools for destruction when they become tactics to fix something that isn't broken. The human experience is not broken. It's okay to go through toxic phases. When we demonize any part of the human experience, we stoke the fire and pour infection into the wound. Remember, the ego, narcissism is the wounded ego. And we all have it. We see this with Al-Anon and other victims of narcissist support groups. I will never understand how getting together and villainizing struggling people while never facing and acknowledging your own demons is helpful. Narcissism is the wounded ego. We all have an ego, and it's a wound in itself, remember. That's why we have it. Remember? We only have the ego because of the wound that occurred, because of the trauma that occurred. So what does it mean to have a wound within a wound? Okay, we all have an ego. We all have the capacity for narcissism because narcissism is the perception of a lack in what you, this is that not you, separate ego you, are, have, receive, or a lack in what is due to you. And it's always a perception, right? This lack mentality, it's a perception. What you are, when what you are is lacking, you can't not be so self-absorbed and selfish and not be fixated on when like you're not good enough. You're fixated on you're not lovable, you're not enough of this, you're not enough of that, you're not good at enough at this, when what you are is lacking. That's narcissism. And this is, okay, so what you are is lacking yourself, and how you are lacking, what you have is lacking. So the resources at your disposal, are lacking. That mentality is just victim mentality, plain and simple, and that is narcissism. What you are receiving or what is due to you is lacking. You can't be so self-interested and so self-exalted that you delude yourself into believing that you have the knowledge, you have enough power, you have enough all-seeing eye-ness to know the personal and private situation of another living thing, and so can decide or judge that what's being offered isn't enough. Because maybe what they have left over is like 5 pennies, and all they gave you was $1. And you're like, this isn't enough. And they're like, well, I literally don't have what you would think is enough. I literally don't have that. What then? It's self-exalting and a protective self-interest to assume to know the sum total of something else as well as their needs. How well those needs are being met, and so what's there for you, and whether or not it's lacking. Do you see how this wound is only acknowledged in our society so far in that it can be exploited? Do you see how these hard to treat cluster C, cluster B personality disorders, they overlap, and the diagnostic labels, the statistic, the criterion that we're using is not actually helpful? I hope so. I hope that I'm raising questions for you. Do you need to know that some person with a clipboard somewhere wrote down that you might show signs of a budding histrionic or borderline? Is it just a self-fulfilling prophecy? You know, somebody wrote down, you know, the statistical diagnostic data for your substance abuse. Is it super important that somebody says you're an addict? Is it super important that you're able to sit in a circle and you know, say your name and chant that you're an addict or an alcoholic every single time you state your name? Is that important to like identifying why the wound is there to begin with, why the ego came online to begin with, and why we've always been nudged, you know, if you fall in that category of substance abuse, why we've always been nudged towards that direction of like, I'm going to avoid this and go feel something completely different. I don't care what it is. I just don't want it to be, you know, my idea. I want my consciousness to be altered. I do not want to be, you know, I don't want it to be central. I don't want to be aligned. Like that's the question. It's not about whether or not you're an addict. Why do you use the way you do? Why do you drink the way you do? People laugh at me like, you do it because you want to get drunk. I like being drunk. Fuck that shit. It's not true. Nothing, no person is a single-celled, you know, I don't care how much of a basic white chick you are. You don't get off the hook that simply. You're not a single-celled amoeba. You have the conscious capacity and the emotive world to be both sides of the same coin. You have an evil fucking cunt inside of you, just like you have, you know, Mother Teresa or whatever people think Oprah is. Like, you know, both psychotic weirdos, but like, it's the idea that the basic white chick would think of as like this high exalted, good, healthy person. So for me, a high exalted, good, healthy person is a grown adult woman who can hold the duality of womanhood, of who she is within herself. And that's good. Like she's self-actualized. That's exalted, good, healthy, whole, you know, it's not somebody who's super angry. It's not somebody who's selling you anything. It's not somebody who's, an extremist. It's not somebody who's who has an agenda. Like somebody who's self-actualized and has their finger on, you know, their awareness on where they're at with their emotional development, be it EIQ or capacity for, empathy, you know, a truly balanced, in union with self woman is like, you know, I know in my heart that I'm not sexually attracted to people of the same sex, but I absolutely, my heart skips a beat and I just get all dreamy eyed when I think about just a beautiful, self-actualized, balanced union with self woman. I think that you know, I don't want to get into like slay the patriarchy and all that shit right now, but like we have lived in a time where, the energy that we've lived in and produced in, contributed within has been very masculine. And I really hope that we can all move towards looking, because like both are important. We need both in balance with each other. That's the thing about dualities. Like, I don't like terms of duality that describe extremes of like good or bad or dark or light. Both, when we're talking about duality and the complicated nature of the human experience, we're talking about making space for a balance so that there's actually both existing at the same time in balance and in conjunction with each other. It's a counterpart. I guess I'm just, what am I trying to get at with this? Is it really that helpful? To define what we are, to define what our needs are with the help of somebody else. Like, is that really even helping? Is that helpful? Are mental health services doing what they say they're doing? Or are they just planting self-fulfilling prophecies and charging you for a good and a service that you will have to learn, your own way? You're going to have to throw the receipt away. You're going to have to throw it away and get your own and make your own. But that's not a concept that goes with capitalism. So we treat mental health services like something that you can just consume, like a good or a service that you can just consume. And it's not. Narcissism is something that everybody has. Everybody needs to face it. Everybody needs to hug their narcissist every single day, because otherwise it's just going to be this wounded, festering sore that just keeps getting worse. It's the Ouroboros. It's the serpent eating its tail. It's the ego experience. And when you tell people that life can be better as long as you buy the right things or see the right provider, seek the right services, it's just eating its tail, and it's a serpent eating its tail. That's no form of existence that I'm interested in. How about we make space for ourselves to be whatever disgusting, sick, or flourishing and healthy thing that you are in any given moment? How about we're just able to hold space for that? Like, hold space for who and what you want to say you are, and let that be okay. I hear a lot of people rattle off, yada, 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 so-and-so is such a narcissist. Well, I'm, for saying that, I'm probably a narcissist too, ha, ha, ha. Stop. Yeah, you're a narcissist. We all are. And I think especially in these Western countries, these really developed, like, super, what are we, like, sophisticated compared to other countries? Like, we're the most neurotic in our heads, worried about what other people think of us society I think there ever has been. And that's what mental illness is. It's a preconception with how you're perceived by other people. That's what mental health is. And that's why we seek services, because we don't trust ourselves anymore. And we want somebody else to tell us who we are and what our needs are, and how we want an easy button. And they tell you that, they'll try to like veil it and be like, oh no, you have to do the work. You're not going to get better if you don't, I can't do it for you. Bullshit. They're not giving you any tools that you need to actually do the work. They're keeping you sick with self-fulfilling prophecies. You are worth your time. You are worth your energy. You are worth your curiosity. You are worth receiving what you are given as a birthright. You receive the sunshine that is poured over you openly, because you need it. It's a need. You receive the water that you feed to your body willingly, without, because you know you need it. You know that you are sustaining that beautiful body by feeding it that water. You receive it. And when our ego is in check and we're able to not be so preoccupied with ourselves, with how much we're bad or how much we're lacking, when we just love ourselves, that wound, it stops festering so much, you know? We can move past it. But to pay money to sit to leave your house and go out in the world and hold space somewhere else, you have to pay for that space, to focus in on how to define and pick apart and, demonize these shadow parts of yourself. Like, please understand that's not helpful and you're worth so much more. Okay? I love you. Bye.